Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Acts chapter 16 verses 23 through 26, we get at least 6 truths about worship. And in the context here, we have Paul and Silas thrown in prison there at Philippi. And they've been thrown in prison doing the work of the Lord. They cast out an evil spirit from a girl who was using divination. And the people that were making money off of her didn't like that, and so they had Paul and Silas thrown into prison. And this is what it says, starting in verse 23. It says, "When they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison, and fastened their feet in the stocks. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were unfastened." And so one of the things that we learn from this text is that worship is not dependent on location. Here they find themselves in prison. Not only in prison, but we could perhaps say in the dungeon, in the depths of prison, in the inner chamber, in the inner prison. There they are, with their feet in stocks. It's probably dark. It most likely is damp in there. Not the most comfortable situation. And yet, here they are praying to God and worshiping the Lord in that bleak, dark, damp dungeon. And so if they could worship the Lord in that location, I think it pretty much shows us that we can worship the Lord in any location where we're at, whether we're in our car or we're in the grocery store, we're at work, we're at home, wherever we might be. Every place can be, in a sense, a sanctuary. It can be a place that is sanctified by prayer and worship. As it said, it's not the place that sanctifies the heart. It's the worship in the heart that sanctifies the place. And we can bring God into every location that we go. That's the first thing we learn. And then also we find that worship is not dependent on our circumstances. Here, Paul and Silas have been doing the work of the Lord, performed even a miracle over this girl that was practicing divination, and yet they are thrown. They're beaten, and they're thrown into prison. These are very bad circumstances. Trying to do the work of the Lord and only finding opposition and imprisonment. And yet they're still able to worship the Lord. And so this teaches us that our circumstances, our worship's not dependent on our circumstances. We might think, well, because I had a bad day today, or because I have these things that are weighing on my mind, maybe financial issues or relationship issues, maybe we feel like now's not the good time to worship the Lord. I've got too much on my plate. I've got too much to do. I've got too many challenges ahead of me. Well, those are the times when we are needing perhaps prayer and worship the most. We worship the Lord in all circumstances, in the good times, in the bad times, on the mountaintops and in the valleys. That's one of the truths that we learn here. And also we find here that worship is not dependent on a time. It says there in verse 25, "But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God." Any time of the day, we could be worshiping the Lord. Even if we wake up at midnight, or maybe we're still awake at midnight, we can be worshiping the Lord, praising the Lord, praying to the Lord, 3 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, at noon, mid afternoon, whenever it might be. Every time is opportune for worshiping the Lord. And then we also learn from here that someone's listening to our worship. It says there in verse 25, after it talks about them praying and singing hymns of praise to God, it says, "And the prisoners were listening to them." The people around them were not deaf and not cut off from hearing these prayers and songs of worship that they were offering up. And we can be assured that there are people listening to us as well. They're listening to whether we are worshiping the Lord, even in the most difficult circumstances, and maybe in the most inadequate locations at all times. And they can hear when we're worshiping the Lord, but they're also listening when we respond in the wrong way, when we actually become bitter and we just become disillusioned and despondent. People notice that as well, and they're listening to how we respond to circumstances. And it should be that they hear words of praise to God, even when circumstances are contrary to us. And then we also learn from this that worship can have powerful effects on our circumstances. After they had worshipped, in verse 26, it says, "And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's chains were unfastened." When we meet challenges, when we meet difficult situations with worship and praise and prayer, then that can actually have an effect on our circumstances. It can actually mold and shape our circumstances around us. It doesn't mean that just because we worship the Lord that our circumstances will always be favorable and things like that. Clearly not. But what it does show is that it can have an effect on the circumstances. If nothing else, it changes the way that we react to the situation, if nothing else. But it might even change the circumstance as we walk around with a smile on our face, praising the Lord and worshiping Him. It might dissolve some of the tension between relationships, or it might help us to think more clearly in trying to solve other different problems that we might have, like financial problems or other problems. And so worshiping the Lord can, in some cases, actually change our circumstances. And then we learn that worship can have a powerful effect on people's hearts around us. As we go on to read, we'll find that the Philippian jailer actually converts to the Lord, and he and his household are saved because of this whole incident. And I'm sure it was because the jailer had heard these songs of worship and prayer, and so that when things turned dark and it looked like he himself was going to be put to death for letting the prisoners go, he goes to him and says, "What shall I do to be saved?" And he and his household end up being saved. And so worship can have the effect not only on our circumstances, but on the people around us, as we know that they are listening to the way that we respond to certain situations, and it can have an effect on them. So these are 6 of perhaps many more lessons that we can learn about worship here in Acts chapter 16. We learn that worship is not dependent on our circumstances. It's not dependent on location. We know that somebody's always listening to how we respond to situations. We learn that worship is not dependent on a time. Worship can have a powerful effect on our circumstances, and that worship can have a powerful effect on people's hearts around us. And so we can see that worship is very valuable and something that we should be pursuing each and every day and every moment of our lives. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.